real good soldiers that had really fought hard and fought long would suddenly become nostalgic for home. They wanted to go home. They didn't want to fight anymore. They became nostalgic. And instead, the military has this and it continues to this day. The military worries that soldiers malinger. So if they complain, they're malingering. Well, these were soldiers that had never malingered before. And suddenly, after 4 years of being in heavy combat in the Civil War, wanted to go away. And some of them wandered off, and they let them go. Some they did not let go. They brought them back. They also called it soldier's heart. Interesting term, isn't it? This is back to the Civil War. This is back in the 1860s. This is 150 years ago almost. They called it soldier's heart. I think that's a beautiful term. Soldier's heart. In World War I, Freud's around, but they're talking about PTSD in terms of shell shock as being physiological. The rounds going off and blowing up or whacking people's brains out and making them act strange. But Freud is around then, so they're starting to talk a little bit about neuroses and so on, and more neuroses starts popping up. And so you start seeing your first examples of people writing a little bit, including Freud, about war, about neuroses, and a possibility that it's not just a physiological response. In World War II, battle fatigue, combat exhaustion, 10% of combat casualties in World War II were psychological. And when you consider millions of guys serving, that's a real high number of individuals. My stepfather was one of them, was evacuated and taken into a hospital and painted and made baskets. So that basket weaving thing, it's true. In Korea, 4 to 6% were psychological casualties. It starts to go down because if you've seen the old reruns of the film MASH, you start getting these units that are out in the field. They're medical surgical units, and they also have psychologists and psychiatrists who are more out where the soldiers are, and they're treating them and they're sending them back out into combat. So you're seeing a lower incident in Korea. In Vietnam, it was 1.5% casualties. Oh my goodness, I thought Vietnam vets were crazy. What happened? We go from 10% to 4 to 6 to 1.5%. Anybody have any idea why? The military got smart. They thought, well, we've had problems before, these guys having to fight for years and years, so we'll change things a little bit. We'll give a one-year tour so they know they're going to come home. They know that this isn't going to go on for their whole lives. These World War II guys thought that was the end of their lives, that they would fight until they died. When will this war ever end? So you have the one-year tour, you have R&Rs. Rest and relaxation for non-military. Any military folks in here? Yeah, okay. I'll try to explain military terminology and stuff as much as I can remember. I try to forget. There's a distinct effort to cut down on psychological casualties in Vietnam, and it works. There's immediate care and proximity, something called PIES. It's proximity, intensity, I don't know, anyway, it comes out to PIES, and the military still uses that. You treat the combat casualty in the field, and you get the guy back out in the field fighting. Why? So he doesn't leave with feeling that he let down his or her now, the females are now fighting in combat, his or her fellow soldiers. And also the feeling is that a soldier that is having some emotional problems is better than a new guy. And it could be true, because new guys come in and they don't know what's going on and they're scared and they're not very good soldiers. Doesn't matter how well you're trained, until you get shot at a few times, you're not really a very good soldier. So the idea is this whole thing backfired with Vietnam vets. Something called delayed stress happened. Because what happened in Vietnam is the soldiers protected each other for the year. The last thing anybody was going to do, we had something called short timers. The last thing you're going to do is turn in a short timers having psychiatric problems and turn them over to the military to fill them full of drugs and ship them back with a bunch of stigmas on their records. So the soldiers protected the short timers. How do you do that? Well, you medevac them for anything and get them out of combat. And we did that. And we got people who were short timers, 10, 11 months, and we tried to get them out of the field, out of combat. But no one ever thought of saying, oh, well, he's hiding all the time and he's not a very good soldier anymore and he's real jittery and he's seen too much and he's having nightmares. And soldiers didn't report any of that. So what happens to the guy that goes home after 12 months who's been suppressing all of this and is suddenly 24 hours after being in combat in a bar in San Francisco? Got a head full of leaving his fellow soldiers in the field, in combat, abandoning the soldiers. That's a problem with that one-year tour thing that I was talking about, because in World War II they went as a unit. And the unit camaraderie and the unit togetherness helped people get through tough things. And they also came back as a unit on the big, long boat ride home so they could talk it through and be together. Instead, you see Vietnam vets coming back alone and coming back to a society that was against the war in large part, and confusing the warrior and the war, confusing soldiers with the unpopularity of the war and being hard on soldiers. Now what we're seeing with the soldiers in Iraq and coming home from Gulf War is society is being very careful not to do that again. But again, I'm seeing a confusion with the warrior and the war. People who are now protesting war are seen as non-patriotic and against soldiers. Whereas actually, people can be against a war and for soldiers. Does that make any sense? I am not for this current war, and I kept real quiet all the way through that because I have a national name and I get a lot of attention. And I was afraid that somebody would twist that and it would hurt my fellow soldiers. And that would be the last thing in the world I would ever do. So I just kept quiet. I didn't go to protests or anything. I went to a couple of things at the university. And I was lucky that I did down at Tacoma, because the anti-war people were back in the 60s again, confusing the warrior and the war, and I straightened that out on a panel. Unpopularly so, but did so. So I was glad I did. Is this making sense? This confusion with the war and the war, how it kind of did a 360 and it comes back around and it's all twisted up again. The poor soldiers is the one that's the victim of all of this. Because now, the good news is soldiers can come home to a grateful country. That's important. Because it is important for the soldiers' recovery to share the experience. That's part of the healing process, is sharing that experience. And without that shared experience, the soldier's alone with the experience. If society doesn't share the responsibility and the blame, it just says it's all your fault, soldier. You're the one that shot those people. If the soldier doesn't have any place to take that and share the blame of war, the soldier carries that alone. And I'll tell you, soldiers will carry it alone anyway. I know a lot of World War II veterans that came home, including my own father, who's one of the most decorated soldiers in World War II, and came home with a lot of guilt. Why? Because he was a medic and everybody didn't make it back. Regardless of the fact that he was in the Bataan Death March and a POW for 3 years, he wanted everybody to come back and saw that as his responsibility. For military PTSD, and which leads me to say this, the highest level of PTSD I have seen as a therapist over 20 years has been in people who work in the medical field. medics, nurses, doctors, and people who had triage responsibilities. This guy lives, this guy does not. We take care of this person is an expectant. You know what the expectant is? They're going to die. We got to pay attention to these people. I knew all that when I got medevaced, and I knew I'd be an expectant, so I tried to stay awake and make jokes and make them want to take care of me. Take care of me. I'm okay. Whoa, over here. I look horrible, but I'm with you. Get me in there. May have saved my life. Worthington, in your book, I want to talk about some causal factors. Should I do your whole PTSD thing right now? Let's do a little PTSD thing right now, then I'll talk about a few other things. By the way, Pat, you can see that I can rap. I can go and go and go. So everybody hang in there. You know, if you have to go, you know what I mean, go. But PTSD symptoms have to last at least 1 month. I'm going to get into a little of the nomenclature of PTSD. Acute PTSD symptoms onset less than 3 months. It's in your book, I'm sure, or at least in the DSM. Where are we at? 3R or 4? We're in 4. We're in 4. I retired. So I have to ask those questions once in a while. Chronic PTSD, the symptoms last 3 months or longer, and delayed at least 6 months between the stressor and the onset of symptoms. Personally, I think all this is ridiculous because people don't report. They don't report. So if they didn't report, how are they going to know? This reporter that told me about the Iraq guys coming back from and women coming back from Iraq, what they're concerned is just about these exact issues. They learned from Vietnam vets and some of these articles that we've written and so on, that if they don't get it into their record books that they have nightmares and these kinds of things within a few months, they're not going to get a PTSD disability claim through. They've already figured this out. And the other thing that they have going for them that we didn't have is the vet centers, treatment centers for post-traumatic stress are in place. And I just did a film for them in which they updated it to include more females with sexual trauma in the military and Iraq. And I was the narrator, and they just did a film. I just did this a couple of weeks ago. So I know that they're getting ready and prepared. And soldiers in Vietnam had nothing. And certainly females in the military up until, in fact, till today, have minimal help. Now, it's much better than it was a few years ago. But still, the military and the VA are very, very male-oriented. And even today, with all the females that are in the military, and I know some women that are heavy advocates of care for female soldiers, it's still got a long ways to go. A lot of stigma, just like in the regular society. Why was it delayed amongst Vietnam vets? That's what we mostly saw. Well, again, as I said, men were protected by their fellow soldiers. The mental health stigma, most men and a lot of women and a lot of people in our society have a stigma. Anybody feel that there's a stigma around saying you have a mental health problem? Yeah, of course. Of course. It's so much better than it was when I first started doing these presentations. The stigmas around PTSD were so profound in 79, 80, 81 when we were first starting to do these presentations explaining what the nomenclature actually meant in DSM-3 and 3R and now 4. And why, also, there was no safety in America to deal with issues. The primary way, and I'll get ahead of myself a little bit here, how you deal with PTSD, how people can deal with PTSD is they have to feel safe. Safe psychologically, emotionally, and physically. A person who is being battered, a woman that's being battered and has PTSD, is she going to sit down and readily express her fears to a counselor? Not a chance. Her husband gets a hold of those records, what happens? Finds out she's doing that, what happens? She gets beat up some more. So there's a factor of safety, both physical and emotional safety. If you had been traumatized and you went to a counselor and you sat down across the desk from somebody and they were answering the phone a lot, not really paying attention to you, and you were telling this deep story about this trauma you went through, would you feel safe? I wouldn't. Would you feel safe with traditional psychotherapy? I wouldn't. What we found was the best way to treat post-traumatic stress disorder is to recreate the unit where the trauma took place. In other words, bring trauma survivors together in a group. A group therapy is the treatment of choice. And so now you see a lot of rape victims, a lot of sexual abuse victims, and or survivors. I like the word survivor better. And military trauma survivors coming together and working together in a group atmosphere as being, and that doesn't mean that works for everybody. People who experience tremendous shame have a lot of trouble working in a group atmosphere. So typically we work in an individual and try to work them towards sharing the shame at an individual level and then a larger level as part of the growth. Anybody here going to become a therapist? Working towards it? Yeah. Okay. I do a lot of teaching at graduate level and with professionals, and so hang with me. If I throw something out there that doesn't make any sense or I use some words that don't, please let me know. Just raise your hand. It's no big deal. It's not your major or something. I'm trying to think in those terms. The causal factors, psychosocial factors, separation from home, reduction in, I'm talking about being in the military, reduction in personal freedom, constant fear and combat, lack of control, killing people, seeing others killed and wounded, being wounded, Dear John letters. You know what Dear John letter or Dear Jill letter is? That's when your sweetheart writes you a letter right as you've lost your best friend in combat, and you open a letter and it says, I fell in love with your best friend Bill. He came over and was so supportive of me. Or your best friend Ann, and she was so supportive of me. It's a Dear John or Jill letter. Well, there's a lot of causal factors. That's a list of a few. If you look to other traumas, we can add more in there, can't we? Your author said on page 147 of the text that I said, he found that American soldiers who experienced problems readjusting after return home had problems prior and during. Uh-oh. Boy, did I get pissed off when I read that sentence. It's the old story. We're back in 1970. Has anybody ever heard of the stigma of the crazy Vietnam vet? Yeah, I mean, that's all we ever heard. And then yet I gave you statistics that were so much lower. What Vietnam vets were that were different than anybody else is we were outspoken as hell. And what generation we came from? We came from the baby boomers. Look at the rest of them. They were outspoken. They were outspoken against the war. We were outspoken about our care. We caused so many problems in the system that we actually, with our advocates, caused PTSD to get put into the nomenclature, and that is a gift. It was painful for us. I was part of that cadre back then that were fighting these battles. Those were gifts. Those were gifts, because now people who have been traumatized, a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker can look into DSM and they can say, here's the symptomatology, this is what you have. Before that, they were saying things like, get a job, man. It'll go away. Time heals all wounds. Yeah.
Didn't crazy Vietnam vet just win the Iowa caucus?
Yeah, crazy John Kerry. Yeah, yeah. And you know what? I remember him from the 70s. He was a leader in Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Yeah, he was very political early in the 70s. He was one of our leaders in the early years as an outspokesman. Another outstanding spokesman in those years was a guy named Bobby Mueller, who just recently got the Nobel Peace Prize. Another crazy Vietnam vet. And he got it for, he leads an organization that is demining, is getting rid of all the landmines in all the countries that have been mined, Cambodia, Vietnam, from Bosnia and all. He led the battle, Bobby Mueller. Bobby and I went to Russia together in '89. That's a whole other story. But to help their returning soldiers from Afghanistan. Oh, ironies are flying around the room. There they go. There goes another irony. Yeah, I have a little trouble with that sentence. Remember what I said, the causal factors, proximity, duration, intensity of the trauma, right? Who we are when we go into the war is important. It's important to how we stand up to the combat. My father, I told you who my father was, and I also had a brother that was a combat vet. And so when I went over there, I had this history of people who could adjust to being in combat. I was drafted. I didn't want any part of it, but I adjusted, and I was a good soldier. And fought hard for my fellow soldiers, and was wounded in doing my job. Yet when I came back, people said things to me like, "Were you stoned when you got wounded?" I found it very, very unsafe to be a Vietnam veteran in the 1970s, and hid out and grew my hair real long and hid out in the woods and went to college forever. You know, after a while, I was trying to figure out, well, what degree should I take here? Because all I have to do is take one more class, and I have this, and one more, I have this, and you know, just kind of hiding out and going to the classroom. I was a Vietnam vet in the back of the room with a field jacket on, going morally outraged about every 20 minutes, making all the teachers crazy, stomping out of the room once in a while. Righteous anger versus crazy, huh? Righteous anger. Is that okay to have righteous anger? If you look at, and I don't know if you've gone through grief work, bereavement work yet, Pat, or any of that. If you look at models of bereavement and grief work, they all start off with anger and avoidance and so on as an early part of the model. And in fact, if you look at treatment of PTSD, it looks a lot like treatment of loss and grief, because that's what it is. It's multiple losses. It's losses of body parts, friends, youth, place in America, love of country. All those things got all jammed up and bottled up when people get hurt really badly and then aren't supported. But I'll tell you what, the most patriotic people I know are Vietnam veterans. So I'm offended when I hear otherwise. There's a difference between righteous anger and complaining and whining and malingering. Righteous anger, including for rape victims, sexual trauma victims, harassment victims, righteous anger is an okay thing. When does it become a not okay thing? Anger. Louder?
When it starts to become violent.
One is when it becomes violent. Yeah, it's self-destructive. That's right. Towards others and towards yourself. And the third one is when it never stops, right? Because after a while, everybody goes, all right, got it. You know, people get tired of it in relationships and so on. It kind of hurts the job. The angry, scowling guy on the job where you're supposed to be getting along with your customers is not popular. So and I'm going to talk the difference between PTS and PTSD in a few minutes, and you're going to see when I go through this idea. My friend Ray Scurfield actually turned me on to this paradigm. What is adjustment? I saw many Vietnam vets in recent years who were considered well-adjusted in 1975. They didn't believe in PTSD, they had jobs, they were going along fine in their lives. A lot of World War II vets came home. They were pillars of the community. They did the Kiwanis Club. They did, they did all the society's things. But there was a little problem in the family. You couldn't talk. Certain times of the year, Dad got a little strange and drank too much a lot of the time. You couldn't talk about certain topics. Why doesn't Dad ever talk to us? Why is Dad so estranged? Why is Mom not communicating with us? Why did they get real upset at certain movies? Why did they... A lot of these unanswered questions in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, right up until today. And the reason why all those things are going on is because people are carrying around a load of feelings and fears and feelings of guilt and did I do enough and so on. Survivor guilt is tremendously debilitating. And if you think that because people paid some dues, like a guy like me that got shot, that I didn't have survivor guilt, you'd be wrong. I carried around tremendous survivor guilt. I was on Hamburger Hill. Has anybody ever seen that film? Yikes. Scared me half to death. Because I have my own film. I don't need to go to the movies. but when you carry around all that kind of stuff, when you carry around all of that, it's debilitating. It's debilitating. So what is adjustment? There's socio-cultural factors involved, critical in adjustment. Does one believe in the war's goals? Does one identify with the unit? What is the quality of leadership? I was lucky enough to be in the 101st Airborne Division, which is taking the brunt of Iraq, also took the brunt World War II and in Vietnam, but a very, very disciplined unit, so I didn't have to carry around any of that stuff with civilians or any of that. Some soldiers do. This was a very disciplined unit. Quality of leadership, society's treatment upon return. Do you see all these factors that affect a soldier returning? Your author also talks about the diagnosis is sometimes utilized erroneously, and I agree. Does anybody here have seen cases where PTSD has been used in a defense case that seemed ridiculous? You ever read any cases where somebody's claiming they have PTSD and that's why they had to commit this crime? This is forensic psychology.
Like the Menendez brothers?
Yes, thank you. Exactly. And claiming that caused them to do in their parents and so on. The problem, the other side of PTSD, using that as a diagnosis to help people, is that it can be abused. There are also people who claim to have PTSD that when you get into their records, their military records or anything, there's no sign of any trauma. And when I interviewed vets, I could tell right away that they weren't combat vets and that they hadn't been traumatized. And so that's one nice thing about having a rape survivor on the staff, a trauma survivor of whatever, combat or whatever, on a clinical staff, because they can see the funny stuff that somebody's trying to pull the wool here to get some compensation. I would say in the 20 years of treating PTSD that I've seen what's called factitious PTSD, I would say maybe 2%. And the rest were pretty clean cases of post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe not a full diagnosis, but at least symptoms. So I would say that that's true. The burden of proof, unfortunately, usually lies with the trauma survivor, who is usually the victim, and that's the tough thing. Doesn't that usually lay that way with rape victims? It certainly does with soldiers. The burden of proof is on the victim, and also society's stigmas. Well, she shouldn't have worn that red dress. So they're going to excuse this rape because she wore this red dress. It's an outrage, but it exists in the court system. And the same within the VA. When you see, when they say, well, that guy made that decision to go down, zig when he should have zagged, it's his fault. Well, that's pretty cold. That's pretty cold. Soldiers in Vietnam suppressed reactions to trauma and developed ways of dealing with trauma. And those later jumped up to bite them. I'm going to go through this, with all this stuff I wrote all over this board, and let me find my way through it. I have this friend named Ray Scurfield, who's this wonderful clinician who was a real mentor to me, and he talked a lot about the difference between post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. And all these years, and this was like 25 years ago we had this conversation, and all these years I bought this theory. I buy this theory of differentiating between post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. And the reason why I do is I think that anybody that is subjected to stress is going to have some post-traumatic reaction. I believe that that would be normal. Do you? Do you think that if you saw something horrible that you would be upset about it later? It's a lot of people suppress that because it's not safe, as I said. There's the stigma. I don't want to be seen that way. I don't want to be like those crazy Vietnam vets. I don't want to be like those women that complain. I don't want to be like that because of stereotypes and society's stigmas. But the truth is we are like that. Because if we're human and we're real, post-traumatic stress, a healthy, expected reaction to trauma. So what I'm saying and what Ray says is that post-traumatic stress is expectable. You should have it. If you're a human being and you really care about the lives of other human beings, and you're around killing and seeing people blown all apart, would it make sense if you were a caring person and you couldn't save someone's life that you would have some survivor guilt? It does to me, because I have it, and I've had it. And I've seen this over and over again. So an event takes place and we have a reaction. And the reaction to the event is taking place. I mean, picture yourself, you're getting shot at, things are blowing up all around you if we're talking about military trauma. You're getting bombarded inside of you with all kinds of reactions and feelings, and things are going on. But within that, soldiers are trained to react in an automatic way, to fight, to protect the unit, and to continue. Women aren't trained. How about the kids at Columbine High School? Are they trained to expect to be shot? Are you seeing some differences between military trauma and trauma of people who are not trained? Can you see how that could be different? A soldier expects this stuff to happen. The kid going to high school or the junior high school isn't expecting somebody to walk in with an automatic weapon and open up on them. A woman coming out of her job or going on a date isn't expecting to be raped by a friend. Soldiers have an expectation, so their reaction is based on that. Okay, I've got to do this. I've got to get this job done. I've got to do this. I've got to keep this together. As one of the things, as a coping mechanism, we may have a reaction and a coping style, and I'm going to go through some coping styles in a minute, but one of the places you have to go is denial. I mean, my goodness, what good is a soldier that doesn't believe he's going to make it? Is a real scared soldier and not very effective. you have to have some basic denial. So why do we hire young people to be soldiers? As you get older, the denial system starts floating away down the Nile. In the process of dealing with post-traumatic stress, there is a process that goes between denial and remembering. And it's this dynamic that goes back and forth between denial and remembering. That's the process of healing. You have to let a certain amount of this stuff in therapy and talk about it to get through it and to see who you were and how you fit in that place and to talk about it. At the same time, remembering can be overwhelming. So a person will back off and say, I don't want to talk about that anymore. Does anybody have any relatives in their family who are combat veterans that say, I don't want to talk about that anymore? Yeah, most. But it's the process of letting some in, and that's what we do in therapy. We open up some stuff, and then we close the wound, let the person get on to the next stage, the next step, gently. So we're in control of the process, right? So that person's not overwhelmed. And that process of working between denial and remembering is a working through process, which eventually becomes an integration of the experience into the full life experience. And I wrote at the bottom here, I don't know if you can read it, is the survivor is empowered. I don't think anybody gets over post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, if vets used to come in and say, pull this out of my head and toss it over here in the garbage for me, okay, I don't want this anymore. But I think these experiences inform our lives, and they make us who we are. And I'm going to go through another paradigm in a minute that will talk about this. I'm going to go over to PTSD, which is an unhealthy, dysfunctional reaction. Sometimes I, Steve Tice, have post-traumatic stress, and sometimes I, Steve Tice, have post-traumatic stress disorder. And that D comes in there when I'm not managing my symptoms well, and I'm not managing my life well, or some other event has come in and crashed into my life that is very reminiscent of this. And this is how I got to know World War II veterans, this very concept I'm telling you right now. This is where I became a therapist for World War II veterans. And my last few years of being a therapist at the Vet Center, I did groups for World War II veterans because something happened to them when they got into their 70s and 80s. When people get into their 70s and their 80s, they're looking at mortality. Their friends are dying. Their spouses are dying. They're having to deal with infirmities and disabilities. When is the last time this had happened for these men and women who are now in their 70s or 80s? World War II. In World War II, their mortality was threatened. Their friends were killed. People were lost in their lives. They had disabilities, they had infirmities, they had wounds. And so a lot of World War II veterans were coming in looking for help who were suddenly, after 40 years, having nightmares, having intrusive thoughts, having all these things going on in their lives. Their relationships were going sour. Well, what happened was, one, they were no longer working full-time, so they had some time to think, and all these things were happening again. And so the last time they ever happened, all those things were coming in. These guys were saying, well, I haven't had a nightmare in 20 years, and now I'm having, or 40 years, and now I'm having nightmares from being a prisoner of war. So and intakes with World War II vets, they wanted to talk about all these symptoms that they were having, and I wanted to talk to them about what was going on in their lives. See, can you see why therapeutically I might want to go there? What's going on in their lives today? Because I can put together the rest. But if they're telling me their wife just died, these things are going on, and they have impacted grief. Impacted grief, do you know what that is? That's stuffed. Impacted. If they have impacted grief that's never been dealt with and never been worked on, where are they going to be 50 years later when they're slammed with a 50-year relationship gone? All kinds of old business comes up, gang. Has you ever had this happen to you where you've had a stressor and some stressor from previously popped up and you find yourself talking about something that happened 12 years ago? Why am I talking about that? It's because it's unresolved and it's there and it's just floating, it's just sitting there. It's sitting there in our hearts, our soldiers' hearts. So PTSD is an unhealthy, dysfunctional reaction. Many people are overwhelmed and get shut down. And in combat, that can work. Dissociative, you know what dissociative states are? Have you gone through some of those, Pat? Yeah, okay.
Well, we did talk about, in our last chapter, the defense mechanisms, which is the way our ego protects ourselves from anxiety, and how those have some legitimacy of denial and displacement and repression, and all of those seem to be a factor in part of the stress reaction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And but a soldier who dissociates is a good soldier. Because dissociating means they get into another space and they don't let all this action that's going on around them bother them. They just fight. You know who were really good soldiers? Were kids who had been abused. Because they already knew how to dissociate. Do you know who the most messed up guys were after all of that? Were the guys who had double doses. Childhood and military trauma. They had tremendous problems. Because they had both childhood and military trauma. But in combat, they were great.
Steve,
Yeah.
let's take 5 minutes. That'd be okay. And then I want to come back and continue. I think our tape ran out and give you a chance to
Oh,
stretch our legs and
absolutely. Absolutely.
folks, how about exactly at 22 we'll start again.
And we'll go 20 more minutes. necessarily said, well, today I'm going to be rageful, but would pick one of those. Survival modes are a combination of the survivor's already existing personality patterns, what we went into the war with, the way we coped with stress before. I told you I grew up with a guy who had been a combat vet, and my father, I was already set up to be a good soldier because I already knew how to shut down feelings and all that. I'd watched my father all my life. There's also the nature and the duration of the trauma are going to create what kind of survival mode you're going to be in. Because what kind of traumas around you is going to affect what. If you need to be fighting all the time, rage works real well. Those guys are heroes. They get medals. They come home and they get put in jail. So what's most conducive to survival? It can be a conscious choice or it can just be instinctual. So think about yourself and what kind of survival mechanisms you use in your own life and how to deal with stress. And as you're looking at other kinds of stressors, situational stressors, adjustment stress, and so on, you might see that people choose automatically just pick these ways of dealing with stress. I'm going to talk a little bit about healing now and then turn it over to you guys. First of all, in healing from trauma, there's 3 stages, and Judith Herman, who is a wonderful, wonderful book called Trauma and Recovery. It's Judith Herman, MD. What's really wonderful about Judith's book is that she covers all types of trauma, and she talks about the differences and the similarities between, say, trauma survivors of rape and trauma survivors of war and so on. What there is in common and what's different. And she does a really nice job. She has a new book. This book came out about 10 years ago, and there's a new edition out with some new added things. But she says that that there's a predictable process in stages of recovery. And I like her stages of recovery because they're simple and I think they're right. The fundamental stages of recovery, and I mentioned establishing safety. You've got to have safety. You've got to have physical and emotional safety to want to work on any kind of personal problems. Reconstructing the trauma story is very important. Now that can be done in a couple of different ways. And one way is by exposure therapy. And that means exposing the client to that therapy of what actually happened, walking them through the actual experience. We used to do things when I was the director of the inpatient unit at American Lake, we used to take the Vietnam vets up on helicopters. That's definitely exposure therapy. Because a lot of the trauma for Vietnam vets are around helicopters going into combat, being medevaced out. Helicopter is the most symbolic thing, and we took them on a helicopter ride all together. They come in cohort groups into our program, and we take them up on a helicopter ride, and Vietnam vets would be the helicopter pilots. They were still in the reserves. We worked this out over at Fort Lewis. And we would have them have a positive experience on a helicopter ride. Because what happens? Everybody comes back okay. Because everybody didn't before. So we're rewriting the script, right? We're rewriting the script. The script said before, if you go on a helicopter ride, people die. So now we're rewriting the script where the helicopter ride through exposure therapy is now everything is okay this time. That's just one example. There's a lot of other examples of exposure therapy. I don't believe say it's not too bad at that point, but you've got a record that says you were in combat and that you saw a therapist and so on, and they made recommendations to you, even if you stay or don't stay in therapy, you've got it on the records, and so that way within the system, you can get compensated for it at some point. So that's a resource, the vet center.
But no, I know like with the military, they don't allow you certain medications for depression and things like that, or you can't be in.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's a contradiction is what
Yeah.
I'm looking at. It seems
Yeah.
very difficult to
Are you
get.
staying in the military?
We both are, yeah.
Yeah, okay. For people who are staying in the military, it's a real problem because if you say you have post-traumatic stress disorder, there goes your career.
Yeah. It's a lot of years to grow away.
Yeah, yeah. And if you say I need some medication for depression, there goes your advancement. And so for people who are in the military, this is a terrible, I'm glad you brought this up, it's a terribly contradictory place. Vet centers, what we did was a lot with the first Gulf War is we just kind of snuck around, saw people. Didn't share the records with the military. It's getting harder and harder to pull that off. But I was the director, so we did it. Oh, is that on film? Oh my God. Would I do something like that? Vet centers are eligible to see returning veterans from Iraq. The trouble is for people who are staying in the military, very, very difficult to use the military system. They have something called critical incident stress debriefings, but even going to that, saying that you have any problem, there's the stigma within the military. It is not safe for many soldiers for career people, for their careers to admit having any PTSD. So that's why we saw people on the sly back then, and I'm not really quite sure what they're doing right now, but I'd talk to Debbie. Give Debbie a call and ask her what they're doing. Ask her that question. All right? So I got her phone number there. She's real cool. To talk to her. She was a military also. She was down in Panama when the invasion happened down there, so she's familiar with those things and is a master of psychology and a real good therapist. So ask her those questions, what they're doing about the active duty people right now, because I'm not sure. Yeah, active duty's tough. I'm so glad that's such a good question because it's tough, especially if you're a ranger, something like that, and you're not supposed to have those kinds of, you're not supposed to have any kinds of feelings, you know? Yeah, there goes the security, everything else. You got PTSD, bad news. Tough for returning soldiers that stay in the military, yeah.
I have a dear friend that was in the Navy for a while there, and she was on the ship, she was a victim of sexual assault, and she was diagnosed with PTSD. I know that she's not the only one. I know that that's been coming out a lot, actually, recently. What is the military doing for the women that are coming forward?
You know, I'm more familiar with what the VA is doing than the military. But through the VA, the person I'm talking about, Debbie Britte, her primary job is working with female sexual trauma survivors. And she's trained and a leader in the country in that. So we got some good folks right here at the vet center here in Tacoma. The military, it depends on what unit. You know, it's a very male-dominated system, as is the VA. And so the best, I think, for trauma survivors and females who were trauma survivors, sexual trauma, and they come out of the military with a disability or something with that on there, the best thing is to get into some treatment and get some counseling and to get life normalized once again. Also deal with the losses and the pain and the struggle of the career or whatever else happened because of that. If the female stays, and males who are also victims of sexual assault, stay in the military, there's just a stigma piece that follows them around. And believe me, even though people say things are confidential, they're not. And you should always be careful what you say, and always be careful. if any of you ever choose to go to any therapist, whether it's for trauma or not, always interview your therapist. Always feel comfortable. Always, you can interview them, not just them interviewing you, and always be certain that you feel comfortable with who they are and your confidentiality. And they'll explain to you the areas where your confidentiality won't be held. And you all understand what some of those areas are from if there's sexual assault involved, or if you're claiming you're going to hurt somebody, the therapist has to inform the Miranda decision. You'll probably go through some of these in the course. But for the most part, or if your records are subpoenaed. So if you go to a therapist, there are ways that your records are not going to always be safe. But for the most part, for 90-some-odd% of us, they are, that don't get into those kind of places. But for females, generally, in dealing with the VA and the military has been a tough go. It's getting better. There's a lot of real good female activists out there trying to fight for rights for females within the military and the VA, and they've needed to. Yeah, you had a question?
Oh, I was wondering, you said that group therapy is the best way to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, and a lot of people tend to do avoidances, alcoholism and drugs and stuff like that. Are there certain subject-guided group therapists that do, strictly people who use alcohol to, for an example, use alcohol to avoid therapy?
You cannot do PTSD therapy on alcohol or drugs. Yeah. It can't be done. Because one of the key things that you have to get to in PTSD therapy is all those feelings that are underneath it, or those honest feelings that are being covered up by anger or are being covered up by numbing and all that. And if somebody's drinking or using, they can't get to those feelings. And they can't get to those honest feelings. So to treat PTSD, you cannot be an active abuser of alcohol or drugs. We didn't know that in the beginning. We had to find that out. We found we were failing a lot. And alcohol and drugs alcohol is a drug. And other drugs were a key problem. So a really good question. I'm glad you brought that up because that really clarifies that. Yeah. I believe effective therapy cannot happen, and most therapists feel that way that treat PTSD. Some will treat people who are using. I would never. There would be no point. So what we do is we recommend cleaning up and then coming back. But then when you got the person that's been self-medicating, then maybe you can get them on an antidepressant or something, or Boost Bar or something that helps them deal with anxiety while they're going through the therapy that is not narcotic or alcohol. And in that sense, we can use some psychopharmacology to help keep people even while they're going through therapy, and that's used more and more, and it's actually quite effective. Yeah. Good questions. Any others? Yeah.
I have a question. You were talking about the reconstructive trauma therapy. How does that play in with, is that used in younger child abuse victims, and how, because you said that was really effective for abuse. So when you're doing the reconstructive therapy, how does that work with younger children?
Do you know, I haven't treated, it's not my expertise. I know a few things about it, but I would defer to someone who works with children. I have not ever worked with children. I've worked with soldiers. And so I don't feel an expert enough to address that. Yeah. But I think it's a good thing that we look into, and we can come back with an answer to that. Between Pat and I.
Well, just to vary a little bit, one of the things that Steve talked about is the dissociative identity disorder, the multiple personality disorder, the older term. That's where a child who becomes a victim of abuse. You think of Sybil, who was terribly traumatized as a child, developed the ability to split and to go to Jim Carrey says it, go to a happy place, go to a happy place. He says it in a comedic sense. But truly, that is how children adjust to the trauma, is to be able to disassociate from the reality. And to a certain extent, some of the most decorated veterans were those who disassociated.
That's what I was mentioning, yeah.
Became very effective because they were literally in another place. Some of the issues with therapy and this kind of childhood trauma and disassociation are very, very controversial because especially those that involve hypnotherapy, feeling that in fact, we agree with some people even think that the therapist can implant memories to a certain extent because they're so susceptible to the disassociation. There are very specific ways in which children are treated for acute stress and trauma, and often that involves play because it's play is how they present their behavior. So there's a whole type of therapy with traumatized children involving puppet play, sand play therapy, drawing, and so forth, where the play becomes a way in which they can express and revisit some of the issues in a safe environment. And that's a very legitimate therapeutic approach.
Are you familiar with sand play therapy? My wife is actually a sand play therapist. And sand play therapy actually is a way to reconstruct the trauma using, it's an actual tray of sand, and the therapist has a cupboard full of figures that are symbolic, and the child or the takes out certain figures and reenacts the trauma, say mommy beating up daddy, or for the soldiers, the tank coming through the jungle or whatever, and works it out. And the idea within the therapy is for them to have a successful resolution of the trauma, for them to have in their own minds a way to see the whole experience in a way that works. And part of why I didn't want to deal with the question was because I didn't want to get into the memory stuff and all that, because that could take us off to a whole nother level, and I'm not an expert on it. I am an expert on military and this other, but I am not, so I'm humble. It's not my area, but what Pat was mentioning, there are a number of therapies, and usually with children they have to do with play, but adults as well with sand play therapy. And you know, it's interesting because we had a number of American Indian vets that came through our program, our inpatient program, who really liked the idea of the sand play tray therapy because of the idea of using the symbolic figures and all, and they were attuned to that and liked that, the guys that use that. So there's certain people like that style of therapy, especially people who are very visual or see things in symbolic kinds of ways and so on. That's very helpful. People are very concrete and can see that kind of therapy go right out on that. My wife loves this therapy, and we had a number of therapists that I worked through that use it. I'm not trained in it, but I've been around it a lot. Yeah. And when I was saying reconstructing the trauma, that can be done in a number of ways, but it is very important. For the key that you want to come out of that reconstructing the trauma piece with is feeling better about yourself as a person, as a child, as an adult, as whatever, as your place in whatever happened, because children often will accept the blame. And they'll accept them. They believe in magic and these magical powers, that they somehow caused mom and dad to divorce and so on, or caused the problem and all. And the therapist can help the child figure out that, in fact, try to get away from the magical thinking and into more concrete of what really occurred. And it's really hard for children, and it's very specialized for children, working with children. Yeah.
Is it a problem if they cannot remember the trauma? Is that
If a person that's been traumatized can't remember the trauma, I can give you an example of one. I saw a World War II veteran, and I read his file, and he was in all of the major battles in all the way through the South Pacific. Iwo Jima, he was in all of those. He was in the Marines, and he had all these military things. And he was applying for PTSD, and he had symptoms of PTSD, but he could not remember one trauma. And they were denying him disability compensation. I helped him get it. But it was a hassle because the system they want to see the stressor. And they want to hear it from the person who's done it. So hopefully we're growing, and you don't have to remember the stressor, but you have to have some proof.
to work through it and everything, isn't it important?
Oh, to remember it? I don't think so. I don't think you have to remember it to work through that, because what you really need to do then, if the person cannot remember the trauma, but they're having all these symptoms of PTSD, and you know they had the trauma, and you know it's real, then you work on symptom management skills. You help them learn symptom management skills, how to manage nightmares, how to manage sleeplessness, how to manage these things. There's places you can go to help people's lives, enhance people's lives without having to do uncovering or direct trauma therapy. In fact, sometimes it's inappropriate for certain people. Not only people who can't remember, but for some people they're so fragile that you do not want to bring those things up. You want to work on symptom management, how to get sleep, how to deal with anger management. You want to work on all those symptoms so they have a better life. A good question again. Thank you.
Just to follow up that, there was a study done about 10 years ago of women who were victims of childhood sexual abuse, and what they did is only took the children where there was forensic evidence that they had been sexually abused. In other words, it couldn't be just a recounted story. There had to have been documentation from medical sources, and interviewed these people as adults, and found that there was a fairly good percentage, it was 20+% of these adults that did not have accurate recollection at all of the event. And that would suggest that there is again, going back to the Freud and our defense mechanism of repression, that to a certain extent, repression becomes a fairly effective coping mechanism for stress, and that it truly can result in distortions of recall as a way of dealing with trauma. And we wouldn't tell these older women who were victimized by sexual abuse that, well, if you can't remember it, you must be okay. That wouldn't be.
That would be inappropriate. Yeah, I would add one other thing to it. I have a very close friend, and we're still very close friends, and I bandaged him up in that battle I was telling you about when we were ambushed, and we're still close friends. We remember that event differently. And when we first started talking about it, he would remember things, and I'd go, oh, I forgot about that. I don't even want to think about that. I'd shut down some of the things. One of the things that we did when we came back up that evening, they had to throw down, remember I tell you we got stuck down there, several of us? They had to throw down smoke grenades and envelop us in smoke so we could get back up, and we were getting shot at the whole way back up. But he told me we picked up all the bodies and dragged them up. And I didn't remember that. And then when he said it, the memory came in. But what was happening to me? I was protecting myself from that memory. And I didn't even know it. But see, I had a guy that I was there with. So I could sort out all kinds of stuff, and we both did. And he forgot things that I remembered. And so we're very good for each other, and at times we just need to stay off of that stuff. And now we're in our 50s. We don't sit. We talk about football games. We've already gone through it. Yeah.
My dad got drafted into Vietnam, and friend re-up, so he re-upped to be with his friend, and then his friend was wounded really badly and was gone. And then he went back, re-upped 2 more times, kept going back. And was that like a kind of common in like units with people that really knew each other, re-up even when they had a chance to go home?
Yeah, I was also drafted, and I did things like getting wounded or injured and stayed out in the field with minor injuries and stuff, and I would have thought I'd been the first guy to try to get out of there. But you connect with this whole unit, and your connection with them and the survival of all of your friends becomes more important than your own survival, and that makes a good fighting team for the system. But that's human nature if you really care about people and you get close to them in a life and death situation. People who re-upped, which means they finished a tour of a year and they didn't have to go again, but chose to go again and said, yes, I want to go back, did for a lot of reasons. Some did because America was so damn unsafe, they didn't want to be home. Some did because they got into that groove of being around a certain group, and they would re-up together, some guys, and they'd stay there together. Some did it to avenge deaths of their friends. There's a litany of reasons why people, only your father can say why he did, but there are a number of people who did that. And you also got a lot of rank in Vietnam, so if you want to get rank, be in a combat zone. Your rank goes way up, right up, because people getting killed all the time. So, I got rank, so I was just shooting up, I was just hanging around. I didn't even care about rank, and I was getting it fast when I was in Vietnam because I was surviving.
I led to another question. We're talking about survival modes, and like one of them like tunnel vision and shutting down your feelings and stuff. And it just oddly enough, it's like when you're in the army and you're training, it's kind of what they train you to do.
Exactly.
Is that like coincidence or?
No, that makes you a good soldier.
Yeah, and if they know it's going to cause something later, if you're exposed to that constantly.
No, what is the Army interested in? Winning the war. I'm not thinking about later.
It just seems odd that they would fight so hard to get post-traumatic stress, in the books when
They didn't.
all it would take so hard for them to actually acknowledge it, because it just seems obvious, they have all, that's what they trained to do.
The military fought this for a very long time. And the military has accepted it and does critical incident stress debriefings and so on, which are sort of like, everybody that has a problem, take one step forward kind of thing. And the only time that ever happens is a whole bunch of guys step back and one person's left there. But no, the military historically has not been a friend to people who are injured psychiatrically. They are usually during the war. But then the military stops being the friend of the soldier afterwards. And the soldiers are largely forgotten. Right as this war is going on right now in Iraq, the administration that is currently in power was trying to cut VA funding. So that's the answer to your question. Wouldn't they? Wouldn't they? Wish they should. Should protect and protect soldiers. Yeah.
There's 2 things that you can bring further inquiries specifically related to these topics. On our website are the audio files. Remember, I have this external links. There is a link that talks about the history of how post-traumatic stress disorder became a DSM category. And Steve, I think, knows, I made a tape and let him listen to it because he knows all the guys and knows the incidents. And,
It's accurate. Yeah.
He was, it talks about the VA clinics where the vets were helping each other and how later psychiatry became involved and realized that this was very therapeutic and positive and then started to be supportive. So that's one page. There's another audio clip about how you're talking about the gift of what the folks from Vietnam gave us. It's talking about how the military is so much more readily trying to treat these vets from the Persian Gulf War 1 and 2, and learning from we've learned what are some natural disasters, Oklahoma bombings, the Twin Towers, Columbine, all of these events, mental health has used the post-traumatic stress information that came from the Vietnam, primarily from the Vietnam therapies and work, to help people have a much better adjustment to those traumas associated with terrible events in people's lives.
Well, and I will add, the Vet Center program where I worked, we got involved in all of these activities, all of these traumas, including the earthquake in '89 and all. We sent counselors to all of these and trained people. So the Vet Center program in PTSD has been the leadership from the beginning. Psychiatrists were the last ones to come on board on this diagnosis, and social workers were first to get on board. People who were working with people in the streets.
One more question and let's quit. One more? Anybody?
You said it was misdiagnosed a lot by psychiatrists. What did they diagnose it as?
In the early 70s, angry Vietnam veterans were diagnosed with personality disorders. People who were having intrusive thoughts and so on, oftentimes were being disassociation and so on were being diagnosed with schizophrenia. People were being diagnosed all over the place, but the most prevalent one was antisocial personality disorder. And what I was referring to as righteous anger, they were referring to as antisocial personality disorder. A lot of misdiagnoses and records of Vietnam vets that harmed their careers and their lives. And that's just why people in the military right now are very cautious of going in and being seen. That's why people like me, I've been doing these talks for 25 years. And I can tell you, I stood in front of, in 1981 with a psychologist and I doing a talk on PTSD, the angriest crowd of psychiatrists I've ever seen in my life in Helena, Montana. And we were in our 30s. And we got out of that room and we got out into the parking lot and we were slugging each other in the shoulder and laughing and going, my God, we were like we got out of junior high. Did you see that? Did you hear that? You know? They came along late. They came along late. They're taking a lot of credit now, but they came along late. I'm an old timer. I'll tell it like it is. I was there.
Well, thank you so much. If you have other questions for Steve, then just write them down. I'll give them to Steve. I'll email them, and we'll continue this inquiry. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah. Good to be here with y'all.